Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Roundup, we're going to be taking a look at three important questions that we hear international educators asking this past week. First up, what are international students thinking now? Next, what does Trump, China, Hong Kong Fulbright ban mean? And third, and finally, and most importantly, are international students vital to U.S. innovation and competitiveness? These are all three questions that are impacted by recent news and events that we've seen in our field over the last few weeks. No issue more important than what came down last week that we discussed on the Roundup Live, that with the rescission of the July 7th order to FAQ that prohibited online education only for international students this fall. So we're going to be taking a look at kind of the continuing fallout from that today. And for those who aren't already aware, we do at SMIE Consulting have our weekly newsletter that comes out Monday mornings at 9 a.m. And I'm dropping the link to that in our comment section on the Facebook page, but you can find an archive of all of our newsletters at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And you can subscribe to the newsletter there or through the copy of the most recent edition of the Monday's newsletter that I've posted in the comments section. And those for those that are unfamiliar with the Midweek Roundup, thank you for joining us, first of all. It's great to have you here live with us on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as our regular half-hour weekly chat to go over some of these important questions and how institutions can and should be answering those as it relates to folks internally that they need to be advocating to and externally about what they do with international education and international student recruitment in particular. And we'll also talk about some of the implications, some overseas times during the roundup here. We take a look at some of the how other countries are handling with different situations, particularly right now with COVID-19 and their plans, and tweaks on what they're doing to improve the situation for international students in their countries. So we'll take a look at all three of those questions here in a moment, but do want to give a special shout out to those that are watching live. Obviously, it's great to have you here. Those that are watching on repeats, either on the Facebook page or on our YouTube channel, and of course those that make the Midweek Roundup a part of their podcast listening during the week. Thank you so much for making the Roundup as successful as it has been. Even though we don't interact with you on the podcast live, it's great to have you part of the family here at SMIE Consulting. Now let's get right into the first issue of the day. And for those of you who have been under a rock for the last three weeks, you might not have heard, but there was quite an important decision, series of decisions made in the last 3 weeks related to international students' future in the United States, particularly this fall term, when there's a lot of confusion as to what the rules are now. But Department of Homeland Security tried to prohibit online-only education for international students this fall. That was repealed within a week or so, week to 8 days, of just an incredible alliance forming around U.S. higher education institutions, higher ed organizations, business community, all rallied together to repeal that in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're all experiencing, that DHS was seemingly unaware of, was still existed in this country, that the ban would have been devastating to over 1 million international students' educational dreams that they had wished to pursue here in the United States, and certainly sent the repeal of that ruling certainly sent the right message to international students and should be celebrated for it. But we know it's not over. But the question is, and that we're going to continue to ask over the next few months, is what are international students thinking about all this? As I explored in recent interview I did with VOA, and also amused about in my own blog for SMIE Consulting, that we've seen a series of events, of rulings, of decisions made by this administration since even before they took office. But certainly the rhetoric of anti-immigrants has been clear from top to bottom in the administration as it applies to particularly international students, but many other parts, DACA and legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. All of those things are impacted, have been impacted by this administration's rhetoric. International education, certainly no exception. And even though there was a success last week with the repeal of that ruling, a lot of international students, frankly, don't know what to believe anymore. That, yeah, it's a great success and shows, I think, what we all have believed is that our campuses are and should be and will continue to be safe places for our international students to come and be educated and to learn from our faculty and our students, but also to help educate our current students but about the world around them and particularly the world outside the United States and what the realities are. So that's really vital, and keeping our pulse on what students are thinking. One article that we're sharing today that was in the newsletter this week coming out of Hawaii, and it shares some relative confusion that international students have related to studying in the United States this fall. Is it still safe, not only primarily from a health perspective at this point, in addition to other issues that have popped up related to gun violence and that type of thing over the last 3.5 years. Those aren't certainly exclusive to the last 3.5 years, but certainly represent what a variety of factors that are impacting current and future international students who wish to study here. So the rules are that were repealed take us back to the March ruling when the pandemic first took hold and universities started going online, and that was a March 13th ruling that allowed international students to stay in status if their institutions switched to all online classes, which under normal immigration regulations are not permitted. Only one per term is allowed for full-time F1 students. That for returning students this fall that were enrolling, if our campuses were doing either a hybrid, which is a mix of online and in-person education, or fully in-person education, those two groups, they would be fine and able to continue studies as normal. But the initial ruling was anyone who's just online only would not be able to continue studying and would lose their visa status and would have to leave the country. There was even talk of, or in the initial ruling, there was talk that those students would need to, if their institution started in person or hybrid and had to go fully online, if that happened in midterm, unlike in the spring, they would be forced to leave the country. So really that was frankly ill-conceived plan in the first place, and was, I think, both the parties involved in the litigation, both on the government side as well as the universities and higher ed associations and states that came together to fight it, all realized that didn't have a long shelf life and wasn't well thought out. There's likely to be future guidance. I know friends of mine on the International Student Services side and advising side have been waiting for this further guidance on how incoming students are going to be impacted, how current students that might be close to graduating, if they're completing their degrees online in the next term, are they still eligible for OPT? So all of these issues are still yet to be determined. That guidance is still forthcoming, apparently. For the last week and a half, it's supposed to be forthcoming. But it hasn't happened yet. So we'll see what happens with all of that. But when it comes to students, when you see all the back and the forth of these cases and the cumulative impact of all these things that are impacting their daily lives and their decisions whether to come or not to come, or to return or stay home, all of that is frankly represents a mess for them. And we're not alone in the United States in trying to grapple with the impact of COVID-19 on our day-to-day lives, and in particular our schools and colleges and universities. We're all, frankly, making some very tough decisions right now, and international students certainly are not alone in that. What I was starting to advocate early on in this, back as early as end of March, beginning of April, when it was clear that this pandemic was going to impact international education for several months, let alone in our colleges and universities, but the world, in terms of realistic options for students for the fall. When it became clear, when consulates and embassies were closing, that are only now just starting to reopen for student visa services, and certainly the ones that are reopening now are not in our top centers, other than maybe in the UK and some European nations where there are significant numbers that are being allowed in to the United States under the whereas there are bans now from Europe and UK, Ireland to the U.S. for travel. Students are exempted from that ban. We had that confirmed. So that's encouraging. But for the majority of institutions, you're not getting the majority of your international students from Europe. They're coming from South and East Asia. And right now, other than Vietnam and Thailand, which are reopening, those are good signs that those two countries, international students that have I-20s that might be looking to come are eligible to go and apply for visas now. They may still get here in time in some numbers. The question is, will they want to? Frankly, it's a legitimate concern in those countries where they've been through it, the virus, they've handled it well, and are reopening now. And that's because their countries have done well, means that the embassies are allowed and consulates are allowed to reopen. But the question is, they look at our country and how we're handling the virus and how it's still expanding, and alarmingly so in the last few weeks. Are they going to want to go to make that trip now, or will they have an option? And this is what we were talking about back in March and April, is are you giving them realistic options that to go online only in the fall or defer? Most institutions have deferral policies in place. Not a lot of grad programs that are fall enrollments only are doing that, particularly if they're more selective. They should be, frankly, because these are completely unusual circumstances that we're experiencing right now. And if institutions that show inflexibility now are really putting themselves at a significant disadvantage if their competitors are being as flexible as they can to understand the situation for these students. And yes, there are financial implications if you defer and do not have a full class in the fall, but this is a reality that's impacting more than just bottom lines of colleges and universities. That's happening anyway. In terms of enrollments will be down this fall. It's other than maybe the state institutions that are going to attract more of those students that have decided to stay local or closer to home. They're going to see some boosts, as we've seen some articles confirming that. But when you see the impact of students' interest in the United States changing, that yes, a recent IDP survey that we're sharing is that students are willing to quarantine if that means they can start face-to-face sooner rather than later. So there are extremes that students are willing to go to fulfill their dreams. If institutions and countries aren't flexible enough to accommodate those, then there's really some serious challenges that we need to be looking at. And we still don't know yet whether international students who still want to come in the fall, that if their institutions that they're planning to attend that have issued I-20s to them are for online only, will they be able to get a visa? Because right now there are anecdotal reports of students who've gone to embassies with that don't have, let's say they're hybrid, or have one, at least being told that unless they can show that they have at least one in-person class this fall, and that's hard when they're hybrid. Some are in person. Their classes will be likely not going to be all in person and all online. They're hybrid. That's the nature of the beast. Hybrid is part of it will be online, part of it will be in person. So for those that are hybrid, that's a real issue if they're not even able to go to get visas, because there's confusion at the consular level as to what's allowed right now. Can a student who and this is the guidance that we're just talking about, that we're waiting on, that the international advisors are waiting on, as to whether or not new students that have I-20s for institutions that are online only, can they get visas to come in the fall? and that is still not set in stone as to whether that's allowed. And until there's guidance on that and that's communicated, and this is always the problem whenever this happens in the summertime, when state or DHS changes the rules as to what's allowed, and State Department in D.C. gets the message, but doesn't always filter down immediately to frontline folks at embassies and consulates that are doing the interviews with students. So this is the real challenge that we're facing right now. The timing couldn't be worse on so many levels for incoming international students. So we'll see where that goes, but students are left confused, and really international student advisors and international missions folks, they're pulling their hair out right now when it comes to these new students that are trying to come in, that they're trying to do all they can for, that there are, thankfully, consulates that are accepting electronic I-20s where institutions can make those last-minute changes that they need to get the word out or get the important information to the students so that they can then apply for their visas in person. But right now, that's not happening. And in terms of the guidance that makes it clear whether or not that's what their intent is in terms of coming for study this fall, whether online, hybrid, or in person. If it's in person, great, they can come as a new student, but even hybrid is being questioned right now at post because the guidance is not clear there. So students are confused, and frankly, most of us who have been on the student side of the desk here working with incoming students, we share their frustrations because we're not getting the answers we need. And as Department of Homeland Security, State Department need to get on the same song sheet here before too long. Otherwise, the numbers of students coming in, as our friend Stuart Anderson at Forbes suggests, he's with the National Foundation for American Policy, he suggested that enrollment this fall could be as low as 6,000 to 12,000 students, and that's if we only have Canadian and Mexican students coming across the border, which is as low as takes it back to 1948 as the lowest intake of new international students. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there still, and will continue to be, because we're not going to have the answers. We certainly don't have our act together when it comes to on the national level with regard to policies related to immigration and international students specifically. But we're in the situation now where there's so much confusion that nothing can move in any significant way until we have answers. And frankly, international students and how they're feeling right now, they might want to come and be quarantined if it meant they can do face-to-face. Yes, they do know that that colleges and universities are fighting for them, but they know that there are roadblocks right now with the government. An interesting article or blog post that was picked up on from two students at the University of Arizona that were interviewed about their feelings on how the United States views them, and it really does reflect the language we use as international educators oftentimes when we're talking to internal communities, whether it be university presidents that only see dollar signs when they see international students, or if it be our elected leaders in government when we advocate because of the financial benefit of international students. Those are not things that, when we talk about the economic benefit of international students in the United States, those are not things that, as international students, make you feel valued as much, even though you're of economic value, of personal value, even though as international educators in our heart of hearts we know that having international students on our campuses certainly makes our communities better off in terms of their understanding of the world around them by interactions with students from other countries, and that is the heart, in our heart and soul, that is what we believe to our core. That these students are valuable. When we have to use language, economic language, to talk about them and why they are valuable to internal and external audiences that don't value that cultural piece, we'll always include that as part of our rationale. But what will resonate most with some audiences is the dollar signs, and that's that language that we use and have been using for years frankly, when international students hear that, they don't exist in a vacuum. They read what we read, and they see sometimes what we say to these other audiences. They feel devalued, and in the eyes of these two University of Arizona students, they feel dehumanized in terms of their value, and because this is the way we talk about them to some audiences. So it's a real issue, and one that we need to be keep in our focus. And it can't change, unfortunately, immediately how these external audiences that don't view international education the same way. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our third question today when we talk about U.S. competitiveness and innovation. But the realities are international education has always been about open communication and exchange of ideas, and those ideas are not always valued at the top levels of government. And even in our own institutions, sometimes they're not seen as the prime reasons for doing what we do. An example of top-level governments certainly missing the mark from an international education perspective is when educational programs become weaponized. And this current administration certainly has taken that stance quite a bit with a lot of its decisions over the last few years. But this most recent one, we all know that China and Hong Kong are issues that this administration is particularly hyper-focused on in our relationship with China and what China has been doing in Hong Kong. Even though it's two systems, one country, the system in Hong Kong is directly controlled by Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party there, and impacts changes that are made to Hong Kong against this two systems idea that make Hong Kong much less democratic and much less having far less autonomy from Beijing, are impacting our political relationships between our countries, where there was talk of removing most favored nation status for Hong Kong in terms of our trading relationships there because of the steps that China was doing to tighten control over dissent in Hong Kong. That's just fact. Those things are happening. And as a result, the government here in the United States is, instead of seeing international education as a tool, it's now seen as something that is not necessarily a benefit to the United States, but is a privilege that is given to China, to Hong Kong, with regards to Fulbright. Once the flagship program of the U.S. State Department, I don't think it is anymore, just because of the sheer numbers. It's an honor certainly, but it's certainly not a defining program for State Department. It hasn't been for a number of years. But certainly the ban, that's something this administration loves to do, loves to ban things. They're now banning Fulbright scholars going to and from China and Hong Kong. So at a time when political tensions are increasing, and this has happened not just in China and Hong Kong, but in other countries as well, with whom the U.S. has had negative relations. These international ed programs, Fulbright, were always seen as kind of solves or solutions, or really a benefit to both nations that allowed these ideas to be freely exchanged and to have the experiences of our faculty going to those countries, and even those we disagreed with politically, and their faculty coming and scholars coming to our country to be exposed to our country and our beliefs. And now that's cut off for a country and region that is particularly, at least from China, particularly antagonistic in its relationship with the United States. And certainly our government has not helped in alleviating that problem. It always seems it's a brinkmanship game with this administration, and like it's a business negotiation on almost every issue, and that has consequences. And this reaction here is certainly by banning Fulbright in China and Hong Kong. is on its face, it's in response to Beijing's tightening controls of what's going on in Hong Kong, but the reality is it's another political attempt to bring China back to the table on other issues and to force them to take positions that they're not willing to take politically. And there's a real that brinksmanship works in some areas, but when it impacts international education, and this isn't the first time, certainly in this administration, and this brinksmanship has been used, but certainly it's yet another example of a damaging blow by this administration towards our profession in international education. At a time when discussion of ideas needs to be happening more rather than less from an educational perspective. So obviously very concerning there, and that decision by the administration to implement another ban, particularly one that impacts China and Hong Kong, not helpful at all, and certainly at a time this summer when our U.S. consulate and embassy folks in China aren't even allowed back in the country yet to potentially start having visa interviews for students. That's certainly not going to happen anytime soon now, and new international students from China who need visas aren't getting them for this fall. It's just not happening. It's probably not happening in India either, because they're still far away from reopening there. So we're in a situation where, as I've been saying since end of March, beginning of April, don't expect new international students in any significant numbers from outside the United States for this fall. And make sure that you've been giving them options for deferral for online only for the fall term at least, and maybe for the full first year. But there needs to be flexibility in what we do at this point, because it's evidently clear that we're not ready on a lot of different levels to open our own campus, and let alone our country again. And a lot of this is borne out in some of the numbers. We regularly use the Chronicle's list. Chronicle of Higher Education keeps a running list and publishes it each week of current statuses of institutions as to their plans for fall. About a month or so ago, we were at about 64% of institutions were planning and publicly saying in person this fall. About 24% were planning hybrid, and about 9% were planning online for this fall. Those numbers have changed and are beginning to swing back, and we've seen some recent additions this week with Cal Berkeley, with Grinnell in Iowa, and others that have decided to shift from in-person to online only, or from hybrid to online only, and that reaction is, you're seeing those numbers on the Chronicle's site for reopening plans. They've gone from about 63% down to about 53% in the last couple of weeks. Online certainly up to, I think, 11 or 12%, and that number is only going to grow. And hybrid is certainly catching a lot of momentum in there. I think it's 29, maybe even 30% now. So we're going to continue to see movement, I think, from in-person only, because our states are continuing to grapple with this, particularly in the South and Southwest, but not just in those areas, which are the areas where the majority of new international students come to, and that's going to have a significant impact when it shows our states aren't able to handle the coronavirus well. It will have knock-on impacts down the road. So our last article that I'll share is one that is one of those questions that it's almost a rhetorical question, certainly from an international education perspective it is, in terms of the value of international students and scholars to our country. That president of MIT editorial in the New York Times this past week shared that international students and scholars are critical to American innovation and competitiveness. And this certainly is in stark contrast to this administration's view that we've seen repeated time and time again in terms of their antagonistic attitude towards immigrants, and even legal those who come here legally through proper means with H-1B, with J, with Ls, and other legal statuses, that they are increasingly put under threat because there's in some circles in the president's base that are very much anti-immigrant, that would think that these individuals that come in are stealing American jobs. And the data simply does not support that. We've shown this repeatedly on the Roundup here, that the industries that many international students go into, over half are studying in STEM fields now. Those are the ones that are not being, just in education terms, but also in graduation terms, are not being filled by American students currently. So there's a gap in terms of the industries that need new employees each year, that international students have frankly filled. And for anyone out there who thinks that these immigrants, these international students, are taking U.S. jobs and don't know the process at all, frankly, in terms of what HR department needs to go through to justify hiring, whether it's for a student on OPT or a company who wants to hire someone for practical for an H-1B or an L, they have to show that there is no other there are no candidates for these jobs, and the documentation to do that is quite extensive. And in terms of salaries that's paid and all of these things, that there has to be an extensive review done before they can even submit their documentation, and let alone get it approved, to show that there wasn't a suitable U.S. candidate for this job. So this is really something that I think we look at, those that have come to the United States as students, who later have gone on to form their own companies, become leaders in companies. You look at the unicorn companies that are founded by international students, that are now led by former international students or immigrants. It's just, the numbers are boggling when it comes to particularly the tech industry. We just aren't doing a good job of educating our own students to study in STEM fields and to then get those jobs and create those companies. That's just not happening. And as a result, we've had to rely, and our colleges and universities, certainly a lot of grad programs certainly heavily rely on international students to fill their programs and to generate the kind of demand, or to meet the demand that tech sector has, other various employment sectors have for qualified labor. And this is part of the challenge in the United States. And yes, we should be doing more to promote domestic students' involvement in STEM. And can that happen concurrently with bringing in international students? It has to, just because of the overall value of what we're talking about here, not only to our economy, but to our students, to our future employees, and citizens here in the United States, about the value of being educated in classrooms with international students that bring different perspectives, different cultures to bear on what we do. And there is only value in that. There's not a downside there, because these are sectors that these students are coming to because our country, our education system promotes and has the best quality programs for what they're looking to study in. But the edges have been worn away over the last 3.5 years, and it's up to us to really start making a change in terms of how we really look at this overall situation here with our policies to immigrants, to international students, related to our programs here in the United States. So more has to be done, and more should be done. But that's what we'll keep fighting a good fight for here on the Roundup, and we encourage you to be a part of the conversation. And thank you again for joining us today for this. We'll be certainly catching up with you again next week on the Roundup or on our newsletter. So feel free to subscribe to either the podcast or to our newsletter, and we'll certainly keep it coming here at the Roundup. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.